Ja'Marr Chase is expected to miss 4 to 6 weeks after the surprising news yesterday that he has a hip fracture, which I believe happened on this play. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and if you're new here and enjoy learning about the medical side of different sports injuries, then please be sure and subscribe for all future videos. This was the touchdown catch against New Orleans, and if you look here as he steps with this right leg, he sort of awkwardly jams his right leg. It sort of ends up in this extended position with his trunk flexed forward and just sort of this awkward sudden jam of his right hip. This alternate view shows it even better. We can see here as he steps and lands with that right leg, look how it sort of just jams on him all of a sudden. If you imagine his hip joint kind of ball and socket sitting here, when his right leg lands like this in this straightened position, there's going to be this hard sort of posterior directed force where the ball of the hip is going to want to slam backwards against the socket in this awkward of a position. One of the most infamous examples of a similar mechanism is what happened with Bo Jackson, where we can see Jackson run his left leg here, he strides out, and then he gets this sudden sort of jam where when he steps out and strides, you get this high kind of posterior directed force coming through the hip joint. Now, of course, with Jackson, he had a dislocation. It was a lot more concerning than what we're hearing about for Chase, but that's the same type of mechanism and why I suspect more of this potentially posterior wall of the acetabulum fracture from that sudden jolt of the ball of his hip hitting into the socket. With our biodigital anatomy tool here, I've shown the key muscles involved around the hip that are typically thought of as the hip flexors, and also, of course, that ball and socket joint. So if we look in the front of the hip, there's a couple of muscles that act as hip flexors. One of them is actually one of the quadriceps muscles called the rectus femoris. That muscle will pick the knee up and flex the hip, but then you also have the iliopsoas, which are more pure hip flexors. If we go down to where the iliopsoas muscles insert, they insert down on a bump of the femur called the lesser trochanter. Sometimes you can have an avulsion fracture where this hip flexor tendon, the iliopsoas tendon, basically pops off a piece of the bone at its insertion. Would be much more unusual in an older athlete like Chase. This is typically an injury we're concerned about in younger, like prepubescent or high school kids who don't have growth plates that have fully sealed and where those muscles are still sort of anchoring into the bone. We always worry about avulsion fractures more in that population. And that's typically with a more forceful, sudden hip flexion. And I don't really see that here with Chase. So I'm less concerned about these avulsion type fractures. If we get rid of some of these muscles though, we can look more closely at that true hip joint. So of course, hip joint is a ball and socket joint. The ball is the head of the femur. The socket is called the acetabulum. And specifically in this case, I would be more concerned about a fracture here in this posterior wall of the acetabulum. Because right, if you remember what we're dealing with Ja'Marr Chase's injury, when he steps and plants with that leg, it's going to direct all this force from the ground up through his leg, up into the hip, posterior against that back wall of the socket. So all that force is sort of being loaded on this posterior portion. This would also fit with the timeline and sequence of events, just because this is not a fracture that's going to show up on a traditional x-ray unless it's really, really severe. So he likely had some hip pain. They did an x-ray. The x-ray was normal. And when you activate your hip flexor muscles, if you have a fracture here, you're also going to have some pain when you activate your hip flexor. So it can sort of confuse the picture and make it seem like it's a hip flexor strain, when in reality, there's an underlying small fracture. So then he continues to play. They still think it's just a hip flexor strain. And it's not until symptoms persist beyond what they expect that they do more imaging with something like an MRI or a CT scan to get the detail to actually see that fracture more clearly. These are on the spectrum of what you can see with a hip dislocation, so it's good that it's not that severe that we saw that with Chase. These injuries can also lead to some damaging to the labrum because that labrum goes around the socket, so that could also be part of this picture, and you're certainly not going to see the labrum show up on an x-ray. So there's multiple components here. You know, other things that we think about with fractures, stress fractures of the bone, but typically that wouldn't be as expected in somebody who hasn't really had a jump in their workload because presumably Chase has been working at the same level for a longer time. And so I wouldn't be as concerned about a stress fracture. So to review this again, the number one thing on my differential would be more of a posterior wall of the acetabulum fracture from the ball of the hip joint slamming into the back of the socket. If we look at that touchdown catch against New Orleans, we can see when Chase strides out here, he lands on this relatively straight leg. What this is going to do is put a sudden amount of force from the ground up through the hip joint, loading it posteriorly. And this is certainly a type of injury that could be missed on a traditional x-ray, display more like a hip flexor strain, and be missed until you do something more detailed like an MRI. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know, as always, any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later.